Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 87 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. After declaring their independence from Great Britain, the United States had to figure out how they would govern both as individual states and as a unified country. For many states, this process involved trial and error experimentation. They drafted new state constitutions between 1776 and 1842, and then revised and rewrote them as they needed. In addition to figuring out how to govern, the state and national governments also had to figure out how to pay their war debts. Most of this work fell to the states because, surprisingly, the Articles of Confederation did not provide the national government with the power to tax. So, the national government just sent each state a requisition for its portions of the monies it owed and left it up to the states to raise the money. Now, most states tried to solve the post-war debt problem by paying state debts before national debts. But Massachusetts stood out in that it tried to pay both. Unfortunately, its approach created financial problems for many Bay Staters, and it proved so problematic that it sparked a rebellion. Sean Condon, a professor of history at Merrimack College, joins us to investigate that rebellion, which we remember today as Shays Rebellion. During our exploration, Sean reveals what Massachusetts was like during the 1780s, the post-war currency problems that led Massachusetts to tax its citizens in hard currency, and details about Shays Rebellion. Are you ready to visit 1780s Massachusetts? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
We welcome a professor of history at Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts. His research interests include early American history and slavery and emancipation. He has published 4 articles and his first book, Shays Rebellion, Authority and Distress in Post-Revolutionary America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Sean Condon.
Liz, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And we're really glad you could join us today because, Sean, we need your help to jog our memories. Shays Rebellion is one of these important events that many of us learned about in school, and then we forgot about it until someone mentions it, and then when we try to recall the details, they seem a bit hazy.
Absolutely. I came about writing the book really when I started teaching in Massachusetts, and most of my research is on southern colonies and states in the early republic, and I was looking for a way to kind of bring more local history into the classroom and really kind of came upon Shays then and started using primary sources and thought it would be good to write a narrative history really targeted towards college students.
But Shays Rebellion is also more than just a Massachusetts story, too. It had important implications for the entire United States.
Absolutely. It's national in that a lot of the issues that happen in Massachusetts are echoing in other parts of the early republic, and also because it has an impact on the framing of the Constitution.
Before we explore Shays Rebellion, would you set the scene for us? What was Massachusetts like during the 1780s?
Massachusetts in the 1780s was a state, a commonwealth of more than 250,000 people, comprised of about 300 or so towns. Many of the decisions made in the state were made at the town level. These towns were overwhelmingly agricultural, although there were important ports, of course, like Salem and Boston. In the eastern third of the state, roughly, many of the farmers and fishermen were oriented towards Atlantic trade and certainly would look to sell a surplus into the Atlantic markets. But more recently settled towns, especially in central and western Massachusetts, were towns that were much smaller, often much poorer, and much more isolated. And the economies there were much more local economies where semi-subsistence agriculture was the norm.
What I find fascinating about your description of Massachusetts is how it reminds me of all the big states I've ever lived in. Each of these states has an active interstate rivalry. In Pennsylvania, it's the eastern part of the state versus the west. In California, it's north versus south. And in New York, it's the famed upstate versus downstate rivalry. But Massachusetts is a small state. It's not one that you would expect to have an interstate rivalry, And yet, we can clearly see one between Eastern Mass port towns and Western Mass farm towns during the 1780s.
Absolutely. Many of these central and western towns didn't really have much to do with what was going on in the east or in the Connecticut River Valley, which was another area that was kind of connected to larger trade networks.
How did Massachusetts deal with its eastern state and western state identities? Did it make any provisions to represent both within its state constitution?
The process of forming a constitution was quite a long one in Massachusetts that really began back in 1774 and 1775 when the colony was breaking away from England, and it kind of got by with a kind of modified version of the old colonial charter for most of the rest of the 1770s. There was an effort to create a constitution in 1778, which failed. Another version was drafted in 1779. One of the primary authors of that draft was John Adams, and Adams was looking to kind of balance the views of the many with the interests of the few. And so one of the things he worked to get into the Constitution were property qualifications to vote or to serve in the House, Senate, or to serve as governor. And another kind of piece of the Constitution as it was getting drafted was what the nature of representation would be. Would it be a representation where every town had the same sort of representation like we have in our U.S. Senate now, or would it be based on population? And that would favor eastern towns as opposed to smaller western towns. And the process that gets worked out leads the balance of power towards eastern towns like Boston and Salem.
It seems like the western towns must have tried to put up a fight. What was the actual process of ratification like for this 1780 version of the state constitution?
The process is incredibly compelling and pretty messy. So the document gets sent to all of the towns, and some towns kind of take a kind of pro forma attitude and sort of look it over and vote up or down. But many towns look at the document article by article. They vote on article after article. They provide commentary and suggest changes. And then all of these changes came back to the convention, and the convention's job was to figure out, can we ratify this based on what the town said? And it was kind of messy, and they ultimately decided that they could ratify it, but it was sort of backroom dealing going on to make that happen.
Was this article by article debate and the convention's process of trying to sort through all of the town's feedback typical of all early state constitutional conventions?
No, each state does it differently. Most states don't have this layer involved, and it did make the process kind of more complex, but it is something that was characteristic of Massachusetts.
In addition to sorting out their governance, the new states also had to deal with a big problem that faced the national government: hyperinflated currency. Sean, would you tell us about this problem? Why was the currency hyperinflated, and how did states like Massachusetts attempt to solve this problem?
Well, hyperinflated currency really makes it very difficult, first of all, to pay for goods because the prices of things become very expensive, and the money that one has, it becomes worth less and less and may end up becoming worth none at all. The war was the kind of direct cause. And it begins because wars are always really expensive, and trying to figure out how to pay for them is always a challenge. And one of the ways that governments often look to pay for war is to print currency. And that's one of the things that both Massachusetts did and the continental government did. And so there's this increase in the money supply, and there's also just greater demand for goods and a reduced supply for goods because you have soldiers needing food, needing clothing, needing weapons and ammunition, and you need to provide that. And so the greater demand for goods and the increase in the money supply leads to hyperinflation, especially towards the end of the 1770s. And states try different things. One of the things Massachusetts tries to do is implement price controls. And one of the ways that price controls could be enforced is through crowd action. And so you see that in the 1770s, efforts to prevent people from charging too much for goods. By the end of the 1770s, there is a growing sense that the price controls really aren't working, and folks who are selling goods, merchants and others, really see this as a dangerous thing that they don't like. They don't like the fact that crowds could influence the price of goods and affect the profits that they're trying to make. And eventually what happens is, after ratification of the state constitution, a deflationary fiscal policy is put in place. And so the state decides we're not going to issue any more currency, and we're going to levy some taxes that will draw the old currency out of circulation, which is what is happening by the early 1780s.
In addition to instituting taxes to pull hyperinflated currency out of its economy, Massachusetts also demanded that its citizens pay for certain taxes in specie. Sean, would you tell us what specie is and why the people of Western Massachusetts found it difficult to pay their taxes in it?
Specie is gold and silver coin, and it's actually the case that not every tax was required to be paid in specie, but several of the taxes were. And this is the case early in the 1780s, and then the big levy in the spring of 1786, which really kind of sets in motion the regulators and the convention movement, is in specie. And the reason why this is a problem, especially in central and western Massachusetts, is there's just no currency in these places. Much of their economic activity is barter, face-to-face exchange, where no cash is exchanging hands. And so when the state arrives and when state officials arrive and the tax collectors say you have to pay in gold or silver coin, it's extremely difficult. No matter what the tax is, the actual amount, it's extremely difficult for people to get gold or silver coin to pay this tax.
This makes me wonder, how were people in eastern Massachusetts able to acquire specie for their taxes? Why did they have hard currency in their local economies while their fellow Bay Staters in western parts of the state did not?
The reason why it's easier for eastern towns is that they're connected to Atlantic markets, and long-distance trade, the medium of exchange is often gold or silver coin. And so nobody liked paying these taxes, but it was easier by the 1780s for eastern communities to do so.
This national problem of debt and currency really allows us to see Massachusetts' interstate rivalry in action. Residents in eastern Mass were able to acquire hard currency from their Atlantic trade, but residents in western Mass were not as connected to this trade and thus couldn't acquire the cash as easily. This fact really pitted residents of the two parts of the state against each other.
I think that's absolutely accurate. And I think the view of Easterners was that the folks in the central and western part of the state just weren't doing what they needed to do. They were living beyond their means, so they had gotten into debt, or they weren't working as hard as they should. And that was often the kind of view. And I think it was shaped by a kind of a not really knowing what was going on in these communities, a kind of a lack of communication between what was happening in the more cosmopolitan east and the more isolated center and west.
Although there seemed to be a lack of communication between the residents of eastern and western Massachusetts, some in western Mass tried to get their fellow Bay Staters in the east to listen. Sean, would you tell us about Samuel Ely and his attempt to close the Hampshire County courts in 1782?
So Samuel Ely is this really interesting character who is Yale educated, who becomes a minister, someone who was always something of an anti-authoritarian figure, a rabble-rouser, and he could see the distress in Hampshire County. And I think for him, he saw it as being directly caused by a faulty constitution. The state constitution of 1780 was flawed, he argued, therefore believed that the government really wasn't a fully legitimate one. And so the way you stop an illegitimate government is you stop enforcement of the laws and compel the government to change. And so he uses very provocative language when a court is being brought into session in 1782, and he calls on people to basically try to shut the court down. And, he uses very provocative language at one point where he says, come on, we'll go to the woodpile and get clubs and knock the wigs off the lawyers. And, he uses very kind of provocative language. He is eventually arrested for this action, and the reason why this gets a very kind of powerful moment is that when he's in jail, a group of sympathizers break him out of jail. And then there's this kind of battle between the forces of government and these supporters of Ely. There's a skirmish. No one's really hurt, but it could have gotten really dangerous. There's a negotiation process where the officials are trying to get Ely to surrender. And eventually, Ely does surrender, but it's seen as a very potentially dangerous moment.
What would have happened if Ely had been successful in closing the Hampshire County Court? What sort of business would have been halted as a result of a closed court?
A big part of what's going on at these county court sessions are legal cases in where creditors are trying to collect from debtors. And the courts are really the mechanism by which creditors are attempting to get what they believe they're owed from debtors. And debtors who aren't able to pay can find themselves getting put into debtor's prison or being compelled to sell items to pay off their creditors. And debt is a very big problem in the 1780s. It's a problem for the state and for the national government, but it's also a problem for individuals who owe personal debt.
So Eli's attempt to close a court wasn't just a symbolic action. It was actually a very practical one, because the people who would have gone before the court were also the people who couldn't afford to pay their taxes in specie.
That's absolutely right. And so this would serve as a kind of way for them to kind of hold on and not get put in jeopardy.
Did Eli and his friends ever try to resolve Eastern misunderstanding about the Western economy by taking this matter to their state representatives? I mean, why did they feel like they had to close the courts to get recourse?
That's a really good question. And, from the beginning of the constitutional era in 1780, representatives from central and western Massachusetts generally opposed the deflationary and tax policies of the government, but they weren't really able to get their own policies that might include debt relief or relief from certain taxes. They're just not able to be successful in Boston in the legislature. And I think as early as 1782, people are realizing that they don't seem to be able to get what they see as a fair share from the state government.
How did the government respond to Eli's attempt to close the courts? I have to imagine that the state of Massachusetts would have responded to this challenge to its authority.
Following Eli's kind of uprising, there are several prominent folks in Hampshire County who write to the governor, John Hancock, and they say, look, Eli is something of a firebrand, but a lot of his support are people who are very reasonable people. Many of them were Revolutionary War veterans, and many of them are really distressed because they had received some pay as soldiers, but that pay turns out to be relatively worthless. They're not able to pay their taxes. They're not able to pay their debts. And they're getting very upset. And if something isn't done, they could turn against the government. And so at that point, Governor Hancock sends representatives, including Samuel Adams, Artemus Ward, and Nathaniel Gorham, to meet with folks in Hampshire County and other places to try to understand what the sources of distress are and to try to communicate what the government is trying to do. And that seems to settle the tension in 1782. The underlying issues are never fully addressed. And those underlying issues kind of reemerge in 1785 and 1786 when the state government realizes that it needs a lot more revenue in order to pay its own debt.
After the government intervention, tensions between eastern and western Massachusetts seem to have cooled a bit. But in 1786, the counties called for a convention. Sean, would you tell us about the county convention movement of 1786?
The county convention movement of 1786 really drew on an earlier county convention movement that began in 1774 and 1775 when colonists were trying to figure out a way to organize themselves to protest the British government and to try to get a sense of how they wanted to proceed. And so by 1786, there's this sense that in certain communities outside of the East, why can't we come together beyond the towns, try to figure out what our grievances are, try to put some pressure on the state government, and also try to organize sentiment in our communities. And so that's a movement that really kind of spreads throughout many of the counties outside of the coastal East, including Worcester County, Hampshire County, Berkshire County in the far west, but also Bristol County in southeastern Massachusetts. And many government figures like Samuel Adams, thought that the convention movement was completely unconstitutional. And their argument was, look, we have a representative government now that we didn't have under the British completely, and that you have to work within the system that we've created. They feared that this would create a kind of parallel system that would only serve to destabilize government. But the convention movement really kind of helps to serve as a way to kind of mobilize people people. And at first, it calls for, we're going to petition government for debt relief and tax relief, and we're going to try to encourage people to get involved in this situation. And what it eventually leads to, first in Hampshire County and then elsewhere, is a kind of call for, look, we're not getting any results. We're petitioning, and the government is saying we're not interested. And in fact, by the early summer of 1786, the legislature ends its session. It had, in that spring session, passed a big specie tax, and the legislature decides to go home and doesn't plan on coming back for the rest of the year. And it's in this summer that the convention movement heats up and eventually, I think, helps to spawn a kind of regulator movement where they say, look, petitions aren't enough. We need to put pressure by closing courts, by preventing enforcement. The same kind of things we were doing back in 1774 and 75, we feel the need to do again.
As you mentioned, the county convention movement didn't have the impact that many citizens in Western Massachusetts wanted. Would you tell us about the rise of the regulator movement later in 1786?
The regulator movement in Massachusetts is a movement of farmers who recognize that there are problems with their state government, and they feel like they're not able to have their views understood, and that they believe that the state government was impinging on them in a way that was illegitimate. And there were regulator movements in other states, actually, before the Revolution. It sort of comes out of English history, this idea that folks could kind of push back against a central authority that they believed was overstepping its bounds. So the regulators never said that they wanted to kind of overthrow the government and completely change it. What they really wanted to do was kind of regulate the actions of government, sort of rein in what they saw as some excesses of government. It really is, I think, a kind of a result of the Massachusetts government aggressively trying to pay off its debt. Every state had to deal with issues of debt, but what a lot of states decided was, look, we can get some money out of our citizens, but we have to make some choices here. Some states said, look, we'll pay our own debt, but we won't really care about our share of the federal debt. What Massachusetts decides is, look, no, we have to do both. We have to pay our own debt. We have to pay off our share of the federal debt. And many of the creditors, the public creditors, were actually elite merchants as well. And so some of the folks that would benefit from the state paying off its debt were Boston merchants and other elites in the East. And so this is a problem that many people recognize, and many in the central and western part of the state see this as the government not recognizing how much distress this is going to cause and being unwilling to kind of compromise on it.
So why the courts? Were the regulators simply mimicking the actions that Samuel Ely took in 1782, or did they have a specific reason for going after the courts?
That's a really good question, actually. The courts become the kind of arena of conflict because in much of the eastern part of the state, generally people supported the government's actions. And it's when these county court sessions happen, and they happen 4 times a year, they kind of rotate to the different counties, and that's the real nexus of state power. That's where the laws of the state can really be kind of enforced from, the outside to these local communities. And so, representatives of government, the sheriff would come with judges, with lawyers, they would come to the courthouse, the court session would be held. This is the place where government power is most visible and potentially most damaging. And it's really where folks who want to protest the government can really have the biggest impact. So that's why the county courts become the kind of center of the conflict.
Sean, if the movement to close the courts in central and western Massachusetts was a regulator movement, how do we know it as Shays Rebellion? Would you tell us about Daniel Shays and how he became involved with the regulator movement?
So Shays is one of these farmers from central Massachusetts who joins the American Revolution as a soldier relatively early, serves for several years, rises to the rank of captain, eventually leaves before the end of the war to return to his farm in Pelham, Massachusetts. He was someone that I think had the respect of many members of his community, but also someone who struggled financially, who found himself in debt. It does not look like he played a role in the early convention movement, but by the time he arrives in Springfield at the court closure at the end of the summer of 1786. And it's a very kind of potentially dangerous moment where there are many disaffected farmers. Some of them have weapons, many of whom, like Shays, had been Revolutionary War veterans. You also have the militia forces that were trying to ensure that the courts opened and that the laws were being enforced. And Springfield is this very kind of tense town when they're trying to close the court. And Shays, from all accounts, seems to emerge as someone who is seen as a kind of military leader, but is not someone like Samuel Ely who's calling for armed rebellion or knocking Whigs off, but is someone who is trying to maintain a kind of an order in the sense that, he definitely had grievances and thought what the farmers were doing was legitimate, but did not seem like he was trying to lead a kind of rebellion. So he's involved in negotiations with the forces of government authorities to kind of prevent bloodshed in Springfield in the summer, and at court closures in the fall and into the early winter of 1786, he's a presence at most of those in Hampshire County.
So it sounds like Shays and his men were successful in closing the courts at Springfield. Did this action force the government to listen to them? I mean, how did the government respond to the regulators?
What happens after this first series of court closures in August and September is Governor Bowdoin calls the legislature back into session, and the regulators, the protesters, are really hoping that they'll recognize the distress in central and western Massachusetts and to pass relief laws. And instead, what the legislature does is a couple really minor areas of relief, but they really want to emphasize the danger of continuing court closures. And so they use kind of provocative language that says, look, if you continue on with this, you're going to face huge penalties. And if you get arrested, you're going to face very serious charges. And so, I think for some of the regulators, there was this sense that until we can convince the government that what we're doing is legitimate, we can't stop. We've gone this far. We have to protect ourselves at this point.
It sounds like the government attempted to counter the court closures by passing a few relief bills and strongly worded warnings. But Shays and the regulators were determined to keep going, to keep closing the courts. How did the government go about enforcing its laws?
The challenge for the state government is that it doesn't really have the means to compel armed farmers to stand down. And so there are a couple situations where the government knows, hey, we're going to have a court session. Farmers are probably going to try to shut it down. We need to have a militia force in place to make sure the court opens. And in Hampshire County and in Berkshire County, no militia really shows up. And in one case, a militia shows up, but it's not entirely clear which side they're going to support. And someone says, hey, let's have a vote. And many of the supposed militia join the farmers. This is in Berkshire County in the fall of 1786. So the government really has a challenge in terms of enforcing the laws that it's passing.
Did the Regulator Movement place Massachusetts in a Civil War-like situation? Were the people in Western Mass united behind the regulators? Were the people in Eastern Mass united in their attempt to suppress the regulators? I mean, how much support did the regulators and the state government have?
In some towns, there is a great deal of support for the regulators. And those towns tend to be the towns that are more isolated, that are newer, that are less connected to kind of larger markets. Some of the market towns along the Connecticut River Valley tend to be much more supportive of the government. And then there are also towns that just don't seem to have a strong sense one way or the other. And it's only when things really heat up in the winter of 86 and 87 that they feel kind of compelled to either join one side or the other or remain divided.
What about those people in Western towns who tried to suppress the regulators and keep their courts open? Mark would like to know what role sheriffs played in subduing the regulators and what the people of Massachusetts thought about the sheriff's actions.
sheriffs play kind of an interesting role because on the one hand, they are chosen by the governor, and this was one of the sticking points in the Constitution. Many central and western towns wanted sheriffs and judges to be chosen by the communities and not by the governor, but they are chosen by the governor. But despite that, many of the sheriffs really kind of have a sense of what the tensions are in the town. And I think from my reading of the evidence, the sheriffs, for the most part, kind of know how far they can push people. And I think maybe that's partly because they're involved in all of the kind of debt collection and tax collection. They're sort of aware of all of that in a way that government officials back in Boston really aren't. And so they're much more kind of aware, and they tend to kind of do what they can, but not push things too far. And so there are certainly folks that resent the sheriff and what they're trying to do to open up the courts, but I think more people get upset when an additional militia force is formed and when militia forces really try to take on the regulators. It's some of those militia leaders like William Shepard, who for the rest of his life, it looks like, faces resentment from disaffected neighbors. William Shepard, who is a Revolutionary War veteran, a general, he's the one who gives the orders to fire the cannon in January of 1787 when disaffected farmers are marching on the armory in Springfield and a couple of regulators are killed. For the rest of his life, Shepard is remembered by some as being kind of a murderer, as someone who killed fellow citizens. And Shepard even has some of his horses mutilated by people who come to his farm and destroy them as a kind of act of revenge. But sheriffs, generally speaking, don't face the same kind of hatred.
Sheriffs and militia leaders like William Shepard played important roles in trying to suppress the regulators, but Benjamin Lincoln played the biggest role. Would you tell us about Lincoln and his work to stop the Regulator Movement?
Lincoln is a prominent general in the Revolutionary War who serves for a time as Secretary of War in the federal government after the war, and he is someone from eastern Massachusetts, the town of Hingham, south of Boston. He gets tapped by Governor Bowdoin to organize a militia force from Boston. This force is originally funded by local merchants in Boston. The idea of this force would be to march into the center of the state and put down the rebellion. So this force is organized in late December of 1786. A few thousand troops are brought together under the control of Lincoln. And Lincoln's very interesting because he knows that this force will have to tread lightly. And he's very concerned that soldiers in this militia force don't antagonize the townspeople that they encounter as they move west. And he's also something of an elitist, and he worries about most of the soldiers are, young men. None of them are very wealthy, at least the sort of common militia soldiers. And he's worried that they could get in trouble. They could antagonize folks in the countryside. But he leads this force. They head towards Springfield. In the meantime, the armory is already kind of surrounded by regulators. There is that showdown in Springfield on January 25th. And then Lincoln arrives, a day or two later, and then begins the process of going after what's left of the regulator forces.
If we have this straight, Lincoln marched west from Boston with his eastern Massachusetts army. He met up with William Shepard and his Springfield militia in Springfield, and both state forces were successful in putting down the regulators' attempts to close the courts and seize the Springfield armory. But Sean, where did the regulators go once the state forces dispersed them? Did they continue to move west?
So following the showdown in Springfield, some of them scatter, but there is a kind of remnant force of perhaps a couple of thousand who remain kind of in one force, and they kind of meander north, actually, from Springfield. Lincoln's army is kind of keeping up with them. There's some negotiation that takes place between members of Lincoln's staff and some of the prominent regulators, including Daniel Shays. That negotiation doesn't lead to a surrender, and in early February, the force of regulators decides to kind of try to leave and escape Lincoln's force, and they leave kind of in the middle of the night and head towards the small town of Petersham, Massachusetts. And Lincoln becomes aware that the force has kind of retreated, and he decides to take his force and go immediately after the regulators. And this is on the evening of February 4th that he sets off, and he's several hours behind the force. By all accounts, a horrifying snowstorm begins, and the regulators make it into Petersham after they themselves have marched several hours in a blinding snowstorm. And they, by all accounts, come to believe that there's no way that Lincoln's force would follow them. They kind of let their guard down. They're exhausted anyway. They seek shelter in the town. Meanwhile, Lincoln's force marches all night to Petersham through this blinding snowstorm, where they surprise the Regulator force in the morning of February 5th, 1787. And at that point, much of the force is then captured. Some of the Regulator leaders, including Daniel Shays, is able to escape north, where they make their way first into New Hampshire and then many of them into Vermont.
What did Massachusetts do with the Regulators that Lincoln's force captured in both Petersham and elsewhere in western Massachusetts?
The state government decides to put many of the Regulators on trial. Some of the sort of rank and file folks get kind of minimal sentences, but about 20 of the more prominent Regulators, either captains or folks who had been involved in some sort of gunfire or other violence, get put on trial. They are convicted and sentenced to death. There are nearly 20 that are sentenced to death in the spring of 1787. Now, ultimately, that first group of about 20 are all ultimately pardoned, although a couple of them are pardoned on their way to the gallows in a kind of dramatic moment. Many of the rank and file Regulators are at first penalized by not being allowed to vote or serve in office for a couple of years, and eventually those penalties are reduced, and eventually folks are kind of welcomed back into the body politic. Daniel Shays makes his way to Vermont, where he hides out. Eventually his wife joins him there. There are efforts to capture him and other prominent Regulators, which those efforts are not successful. And then after the rebellion kind of dies down, Shays and some other prominent figures ask for a pardon and eventually are granted a pardon in 1788 by the government.
Massachusetts pardoned a lot of citizens for their role in the Regulator movement, but from the state's perspective, their actions constituted a form of treason. Did the state execute anyone for their role in the rebellion?
There are two men that are put to death that are involved in actions in Berkshire County in the spring. And so the situation in Berkshire County is a little more unsettled after Petersham. There continues to be skirmishes, and there are groups of men that sort of hide out across the state line in New York, make their way into communities along the border, and actually engage in some kidnapping and some robbing and some kind of general mayhem. And it takes a while for that to be brought under control. And there are a couple of men who are charged with robbery that are eventually put to death. It doesn't seem like either of those two men had a direct role in the early Regulator movement, but got kind of caught up in its aftermath.
When we started our conversation, we mentioned that Shays Rebellion wasn't just a local Massachusetts story, but a national story. Would you tell us what role the Regulator movement played in the drafting of a new national constitution in 1787?
The impact is not clear and direct. There's not this happened and so this happened. But I think one thing that's definitely clear is that the actions in Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787 convinced a lot of people that were thinking the government needed to be reformed, convinced them that it needed to be reformed, and convinced them that significant change needed to take place. And in the book, I recount the story of one prominent figure, of course, is George Washington, and it's pretty clear that Washington does not want to be involved in this meeting that's going to happen in Philadelphia. And the purpose was supposed to be to kind of look at the Articles of Confederation and consider some changes. And at first, he's not very interested. And in fact, he tells the governor of Virginia he's not going to go. He then begins to hear reports of what's going on in Massachusetts. He's getting those reports from Henry Knox, the Secretary of War. Knox is convinced that the Regulators are bent on a revolution, and Knox sees them as very radical and convinces Washington, I think, that there's some significant danger and that a much stronger central government is needed. And I think that plays an important role in ultimately convincing Washington to take part in the convention, which gives it legitimacy. And I think that, combined with this general sense that, look, significant changes need to be made. We can't just tinker around the edges of the articles, but we needed a much stronger central government.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Shays Rebellion had not occurred? Would the Constitutional Convention of 1787 have happened? Would the framing of the new national government have been different?
Liz, that's a very good question. And I think it's entirely possible that if the rebellion had not occurred, the same kind of urgency that many members of the Constitutional Convention had to completely revamp the document, they may not have had that same sense of urgency. And it may have been the case that a kind of a revised Articles of Confederation, not a completely new Constitution, might have been the result.
Sean, now that you've covered Shays Rebellion, what's next for you?
I am working on a labor history of the Atlantic world, which looks at the ways that people owed labor to others outside of a wage relationship. The book is entitled Labor Obligations, and it looks at the different kinds of obligations to kin, to community, to elite in different parts of the Atlantic world in the early part of European colonization.
Where should we look for more information about you and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions about Shays Rebellion?
The best way to get in touch is my website at Merrimack College. You can find it by entering Merrimack College and Sean Condon into Google.
Sean Condon, thank you for leading us through Shays Rebellion and for helping to refresh our memories about it.
Liz, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for asking me.
Shays Rebellion, or the Massachusetts Regulator Movement, provides us with a window onto many of the problems the new United States faced after they won their independence. One problem dealt with governance. How was a state and nation supposed to govern when they ultimately lacked the financial resources and stability of a long-standing government? When Samuel Ely led the first movement to close the courts, the Massachusetts government had only existed for 2 years. And when the regulators made their move against the courts, the state government had been around for just 6 years. 6 years isn't a very long time. And state leaders must have really worried what would happen to Massachusetts if they acted and failed to suppress the rebellion. Another problem facing the new states and nation was a lack of hard currency or specie. Since the earliest days of colonial America, mainland North America suffered from a currency shortage. It relied on importations of gold and silver coins from all over the Atlantic world to pay its international debts, and on a combined system of currency, trade, and barter to pay domestic debts. As Sean revealed, Central and Western Massachusetts were not yet at a point in 1786 where they had transitioned from an economy based largely on barter and trade to one based largely on cash. And this wasn't just a problem in Central and Western Massachusetts either. It was a problem that all frontier regions in all 13 states faced. So it's no wonder that Shays and his fellow regulators felt they needed to say and do something when the state failed to realize the extra challenges its western regions experienced in acquiring hard currency. You can find information about Sean, his book Shays Rebellion, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/087. Just as Daniel Shays and his fellow regulators participated in the Massachusetts Regulator Movement, you could participate in a movement that we have here at Ben Franklin's World. It's called the Ben Franklin's World Movement, and it's a campaign that offers different ways for you to help support the podcast and its mission to restore history to the forefront of the public mind. For more information about the movement, visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement or text support BF World to 33444. Finally, do you think Daniel Shays and the other regulators really had no other choice but to conduct military actions against their state government? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.